Removing the Cherokee from the area that they occupied became a problem after the U.S. won the Revolutionary War, because now they had these Native Americans and they didn't really know what to do with them. So what they did was they came up with a treaty called the Hopewell Treaty, but it failed. So then it fell on the hands of Henry Knox, who believed that if they didn't find a peaceful way to approach the removal or movement of the Cherokee, there would be war that the United States didn't have the money or manpower to embark on. And he also felt that the United States had a moral obligation to keep the Native Americans alive, because if they didn't do something, in turn, what would happen was the extinction of the Native Americans. So he came up with something that was later coined the expansion with honor, which allowed the U.S. government to help civilize the savage Native Americans. In 1790, Congress passed a treaty that would make people wanting to buy land to have to purchase it by establishing a treaty from Native Americans. In this expansion, some of the provisions were that they would buy the land that settlers had encroached on illegally prior to the expansion. They would prohibit further encroachment, and that they would take step towards civilizing the Native Americans. Their hope was then to civilize them, and they would kind of eventually just blend into the American society or the United States culture. They offered schools eventually and supplies for farming and agriculture, but the Indians really took this and just took what they wanted from this whole treaty. They followed the rules, but when it came to like schooling, they participated in the schooling, but they didn't really participate in the religious part. But they did understand that there was an importance to what they were being taught, that they needed to absorb and understand what the new world was going to be like, because they were very well aware that the world that they had lived in was no more. Eventually, though, up until this point, people had thought that the Native Americans were inferior because of culture, and that was something that they could ultimately be taught to differ. However, eventually people started thinking that it wasn't a cultural thing, it was a race thing. And if in fact it was a race thing, that meant that they would always be inferior. The race is something that they couldn't control, something that they couldn't teach to be different, you know? So that caused a change in the mindset of the people. And in May 28th of 1830, Congress passed the Removal Act. The Native Americans tried to fight it. They took it to the courts, but eventually in the spring of 1836, it was ratified, and it gave the Cherokee 2 years to prepare to be removed. Unfortunately, most of them didn't listen, didn't think it was possible that it would happen, so they continued to live their lives. But 2 years later, in 1838, soldiers arrived and started rounding people up. And by winter of 1838 to 1839, the Cherokee left. They moved west, and unfortunately, that trail is called the Trail of Tears. It's a really sad story, actually, reading it. It's sad that ultimately what happened was greed. I think greed was a big force that made the U.S. kind of step on these other people and find any excuse to find them less than. There were a couple of people that did fight for them, but ultimately race was a huge issue in greed, and it's a common theme in U.S. history, unfortunately. But those are the things that happened. A quick synopsis of what happened with the Cherokee and their removal.